Hey everyone, Professor Davis here, and we are going to now focus in on the eukaryotes here in microbiology. This particular one's going to do an introduction of fungi, algae, protozoa, and helminths, which are the different types of microorganisms that we're going to be studying that fall into the eukaryotic group, meaning these are the cells that have a nucleus and organelles. So let's look at kingdom Protista first. Now with kingdom Protista, there are two examples that are located here that are studied a lot of times in microbiology. And the first is going to be algae and then protozoa. Now, algae is plant-like. It's not a plant, but it's plant-like. Whereas protozoa is animal-like. It's not an animal, but it's like an animal. Now, this creates some big issues in the kingdom Protista, and as taxonomy starts to evolve and change, we may see that this breaks up into more kingdoms later. But right now, we're looking at it as just Protista. Now, we're going to focus here on the algae and protozoa, but we do see that there are water and slime molds present. These guys act like fungus, okay? So you have your three types, right? Plant-like, animal-like, and fungus-like. And so again, this is what causes confusion in this particular kingdom. So let's look at algae first. Algae is plant-like. It is a photoautotroph, meaning it's going to use light in order to make its own food. Okay, it doesn't rely on consuming food from other areas. It's going to make its own food, but it's going to do it using light, specifically a type of photosynthesis. We do see that these guys are eukaryotes, meaning that their cells do contain a nucleus and organelles. Most algae, believe it or not, is actually unicellular, but there are a few exceptions. Some of them are going to be multicellular, and these are the type of algae that you would normally term as like seaweed. So this is like brown algae, red algae, green algae. Sometimes we call it kelp, but they look a lot like plants in the water, but they're not. They actually lack the tissues that plants have for roots, stems, and leaves, and so they can't be classified as plants. They are categorized by their predominant photosynthetic pigment. So whatever pigment is present most that helps them do photosynthesis, that is how they are put into a group, whether they're green algae, brown algae, or red algae. Another way they might also be divided into groups is their cell wall composition. There are some types of algae that are called diatoms, and their cell wall is made out of a structure called silica, which is very similar to sand and glass. All right, and so it has a different structure, which puts it into a different group. Now, the significance of algae is a lot of times ecological as well as economic. So ecologically, we do see that they are producers. They are the base of the food chain, specifically in the ocean. They are going to be the phytoplankton food that's for the zooplankton. So they're the bottom or base of the food chain, which also means they do produce large amounts of oxygen, which is also good. We see that economic-wise, if we're going to talk about money making, we do see that brown algae or seaweed is used for foods. A lot of times they use it as a thickener agent in different foods. Red algae is also a seaweed. It's used in foods and also making the agar that we talked about for our plates. Those agar plates are going to have some red algae in it. And again, it helps thicken it up to where it's kind of like a gel. It has a kind of gelatinous type of ability structure. Some are going to produce toxins. This actually is a bad thing that it can do economic-wise. Dinoflagellates can actually release a lot of toxins into water and cause what we call algal blooms. This causes red tides. Red tides are going to have this toxin that ultimately affects shellfish. So it poisons them, it paralyzes them, and that can destroy some of our markets that we have for shellfish for food sources, okay? And so we can't eat those if they have been poisoned by these red tides. All right, so this group algae is kind of important in this way. Now, none of these really make us sick directly. They cause problems like economically, but protozoa, the next group in Protista, do cause diseases to us as humans. So these are the animal-like ones. These guys are going to be heterotrophic, where they have to eat or ingest their food. These are also eukaryotes, which means they do contain a nucleus and organelles. There are a few exceptions to this group. Euglenoids and dinoflagellates kind of get put in between both. They are able to do photosynthesis like algae, but they also can consume their food. It's kind of like, say, like a Venus flytrap, where they make their own food, but they also kill off insects and eat them in a way. These guys will do something similar. And so again, this is what creates some issue within the kingdom Protista. These guys are unicellular. When we look here, there's going to be a reservoir, and these reservoirs vary. Sometimes they have a water environment they need. Other times it could be soil. We actually see these guys can also be in the guts of animals. And so depending on what kind they are, may depend on where their reservoir is. There's relatively few that do cause diseases, but we will talk about the ones who do. And a lot of times when they cause illness for us, we are their accidental host. They didn't want to get inside of us, but they did. And since they did, then they make us sick, okay? Because they're trying to get out. So we are normally accidentally infected with these. Now, this group Protozoa does have two forms or variations that are present. They have their cyst form. The cyst form is how they infect, and that's the more dormant stage. And you can see those here in the pictures. And they also have what we call the trophozoites form, which is the feeding and growing stage form. So kind of like eggs versus the actual organism. Okay, that's kind of how you can think about them. But they have the cysts and the trophozoites. Now, cysts are to protozoa as endospores are to bacteria. These cysts can lay dormant in the conditions for long periods of time, protecting them, keeping them in a survival state until conditions are better for them to actually kind of reemerge and germinate into the trophozoite stage where they can start to grow and develop. All right, so in this group, when we talk about the protists and the protozoas, we're going to be looking at several groups. And so we want to talk about a couple of the groups. And in the group protozoa, they get named or classified a lot of times by how they move, okay? So their form of movement. In this particular case, the first one we want to look at, they move by flagella. So those little tail-like extensions that allow them to swim. Okay, so this is the group that we want to look at. They do have the flagella, and one of the main groups is the hemoflagellates, which are blood parasites. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about them more in a second. So some clinically significant ones that fall into this group that have the flagella, and they are pathogens, meaning they make us sick, are listed here in this chart. The first one is the Giardia lamblia. This one can cause us to have diarrhea, and it is passed on through the fecal oral route. So somebody not washing their hands who's infected, and then they ultimately give it to somebody else that then ends up in their mouth somehow. And I know it's gross to think about, but that's how most types of food poisoning happens. We also have the Trichomonas vaginalis. This is vaginitis. It causes inflammation in the vagina, and this one is a sexually transmitted disease. And so you can see digestive system, reproductive system. The hemoflagellates are the ones who are going to affect your cardiovascular and lymphatic system, so where the blood is located. This is going to be Leishmania. This one invades tissues, and the vector is a sandfly. So sandflies carry them, and when they bite people, they inject this into their blood, and it causes illness. Another one are the Trypanosomia. This group is going to cause things like African sleeping sickness. This one, the vector is a tsetse fly, again, a type of fly that bites you, and then it transmits it. And then we also have Chagogs, which its vector is the kissing bug. This is a type of beetle that gets its name because it's drawn to your mouth because of carbon dioxide. So while you're sleeping, it's drawn to your mouth. It potentially bites you. It's not going to be its bite that actually infects you. It bites you and leaves open areas, but as it defecates while it's eating, because it's a bug, it gets into those open areas and can cause illness. All right, and these guys are located here. Now, the Trypanosomias are really unique because they can evade your immune system. They hide in plain sight. So they show your immune system that they're there, and your immune system works to fight them. But by the time your immune system's ready to fight them, they've changed what they look like. They're still an invader, and your immune system's like, hey, where did that guy go? Oh, here's a new guy I can fight. that creates a big issue because your immune system is working in overdrive and it makes you super tired. This is one reason why that disease is called African sleeping sickness, because it makes you super tired. Eventually, the patient falls into a coma and can die because of it. All right, and so these are just some examples, and they all move by a flagella, a tail. Okay. The next one we want to look at are the ones who move by a pseudopod. So this is a false foot, and so it's going to push it and pull forward. So it's going to extend its cytoplasm and pull itself forward. The main individual in this group are the amoebas. Okay, so the amoebas. So Entamoeba histolytica, this one is going to cause amoebic dysentery. This is a lot of times found in contaminated water. One reason why when you visit other countries, sometimes they'll tell you not to drink the water. Like if you go to a hotel, they'll have bottled water for you to drink, but also bottled water for you to brush your teeth with. This is why, because the water contains this type of amoeba. Another one is the Naegleria, which causes meningoencephalitis. Now, meningoencephalitis is inflammation of the meninges, which cover the brain and spinal cord, and encephalitis is inflammation of the actual brain tissue. And again, this one is also found in water. The next group are the ones that are non-motile. They don't actually move on their own. These guys are known as amplicomplexia because their life cycles are super complex. They actually involve having more than one host. They are considered intracellular parasites because they have to get into your cells. They're just very, very complicated in this group. These guys include things like plasmodomia. Plasmodomia causes malaria, and the vector is a specific type of mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, and it's going to bite you, and it ultimately transmits malaria into your blood, and then you now have malaria. Another one is the toxoplasma. This one's from ingesting it. You have to actually consume it. It then invades your tissues and gives you flu-like symptoms. Okay. The last one here is the Cryptosporidium. This one causes diarrhea, so it affects your digestive system, and it is transmitted through the fecal-oral route. Okay. So again, from people not necessarily washing their hands, or something gets contaminated with fecal material and then it's consumed and eaten, taken into the body. So these are some examples of the non-motile groups. The last group of movement is the cilia. Cilia are the little hair-like extensions that allow them to move, and these are known as the ciliates. The ciliates, one of the main ones that you need to know, Bacillium coli. Bacillium coli causes diarrhea, and it is the only known human parasite in this group. So out of all the ciliates on the planet, this is the only one that causes disease in humans, and it enters through the digestive tract. Now, the last little subgroup that is part of the protista are the water and slime molds. These are the fungus-like structures. They are heterotrophic, so they do consume their food, and they are still eukaryotes. These guys produce spores. That's how they reproduce, and this is what makes them fungus-like. So they produce spores in a structure called a sporangia, and that's going to be why they are considered fungus-like. Now, some water molds are called like the Oomycota. These guys are decomposers. They're associated a lot of times though with crop failures, and so if they decompose and get in and they infect the crops, they can kill them. An example of this is what happened in the potato famine in Ireland in the mid 1800s. It was a water mold that destroyed the crop of potatoes, and 1 million people died in Ireland due to this. So it can actually cause some major issues. Another type are the slime molds. Slime molds are also decomposers. There are cellular and plasmodomal forms. These guys are going to exhibit an amoeboid-like movement where it looks like they're like pulling forward and growing, kind of like with a pseudopod type structure. And they are kind of slimy. And you can find these on like the floor of the forest and sometimes, but they look kind of like dog vomit is what they look like, or vomit on the ground, and that's why they get the slime mold look to them. So these are just some examples of that last group. So the next kingdom that's significant that are eukaryotes is the fungi. All right, and so let's talk about the fungus group. This is also known as mycology if you are studying the fungus group specifically. So some general characteristics when we're talking about fungus are going to be that they are heterotrophic. They do consume their own food. They're eukaryotes, meaning, remember, they have a nucleus and organelles. They have a cell wall. This cell wall is made out of chitin or chitin, and they do produce spores. That's how they reproduce. So when we look at fungi, there are the vegetative forms. The vegetative structures and form is going to be with molds. Molds are multicellular, okay, so many cells, and they do have some specific structures. These structures are known as hyphae and mycelium. So hyphae are known as the filaments. These guys look like little strings that make up the body of the fungus. Some of them actually have septate in them, where they have these cross walls, and you can see that in this picture. Whereas some are aseptic. Remember, we put A in front of the word, it means without, and so they don't have those little cross walls that are present. Mycelium is a collection of the hyphae. So one of the strings is a hyphae, but when there's a group of them, we call it mycelium. So vegetative hyphae is going to be where they actually obtain their nutrients from. They're going to use that hyphae to absorb the food and to be able to grow. Some of these hyphae are known as aerial hyphae, so they're going to be above ground, and they function to produce reproductive spores for either sexual or asexual reproduction. And so they're going to come up and they're going to have those reproductive structures on the ends, which then allows them to release their spores. Now, this is one reason why fungi, if it's growing on a plate, they're called lid risers. As they create those aerial hyphae and they push up, they will actually raise the lid of the plate as they grow. Another thing that you have to be really careful is if fungus is growing on your plates, you don't want to open it up, because if they produce all those spores, they'll release them when you open the plate, and you just had a concentrated group of fungus now be released into the air. And so we want to keep those closed. So in my class specifically, if there is fungus growing on it and there's lid risers, we tape it shut and we don't actually open them up to look at them. So types of spores that are produced asexually through mitosis, put them into these different groups. And so we first see the conididea spores. The conididea spores are where the spores are not enclosed in any kind of sac. So you'll just notice that the spores start to extend out and they just then start to be released, okay? The arthroconididea is going to be where they have fragments of the septate in the hyphae that are going to break off. All right, and so those cross walls break off and they release them. Okay, so these are kind of going to form what we call a segmentation. They're in segments. The blastoconididea are going to be where they are going to have budding. This is an uneven type of budding though, where the new one is going to bud off and it's smaller than the original. But we do see that yeast does this most of the time. Okay, so it's uneven. So the next group is the chlamydoconididea. This one is where spores are within the hyphae. So you can see that they're kind of inside of these little bubble-like structures of the hyphae. And then we have the sporangiospores. Sporangiospores is where the spores are collected all in one sac, and then the sac opens up to release all of the spores. Okay, so these are some different groups. So clinical significance of molds are going to be that some of these ultimately cause some issues with either our food sources, and then they can cause disease for us as well. So this first one are the rhizopus. These guys kind of look like they have lollipop heads. These guys are the sporangiospores. So they're going to have the spores inside of those lollipop heads and then release the spores. Then we have aspergillus. Aspergillus look more like the dandelion heads, like dandelions, and these are the conidiospores, where they just release the spores. So if you were to take the dandelion and blow, they would just release. The next one over here are the dermatophytes. Dermatophytes are the type of fungus that actually cause issues in our skin specifically. This is an example of ringworm. They have the microconididea that are present that they release, and they end up causing a lot of times rashes in our skin. Another one that's significant is yeast itself. Yeast is the unicellular form of fungus. It is non-filamentous, so it does not have hyphae. Is single-celled. These guys reproduce via asexual budding, so they bud off and they are going to make new yeast. Some produce germ tubes. These germ tubes also have what we call pseudohyphae that might be present. We ID a lot of these through biochemical testing, specifically through fermentation of different types of sugars. And some clinical significance of yeast are going to be things like Candida albicans. This is the one that ultimately causes issues in immunosuppressed patients, or when your immune system is down, because this is an opportunistic type of fungus. It can cause things like thrush. We also have Cryptococcus. Cryptococcus is known to cause meningitis, and then we have the pneumocystis. This one can cause versions of pneumonia. So this first picture shows you an example of budding. We then have an example of the germ tube with the pseudo-hyphae that are present, so the false hyphae. You also can see that they can use a negative stain on like the Cryptococcus, and these guys are going to just give you some examples of those fungi. Now, some fungus are what we call dimorphic. If they're dimorphic fungi, they have a lot of medical importance because they have a mold version and they have a yeast version. This version is determined based on the temperature. So when we see the dimorphic, the mold grows at 25 degrees Celsius, so where it's a little bit cooler on the outside of our body. But it will grow as a yeast at 37 degrees Celsius, which is like our body temperatures. And so dimorphic fungi are important because they do have the two different phases. Right? And so you can see some examples here. They show you the different types. They show you the mold version. They also show you the yeast version. And so when we're looking at these, like the coccidioides, that one causes San Joaquin Valley fever. We also see the histoplasma can cause a lot of issues due to bat bites or bird droppings is where that one comes from. The sporothics can also come from like roses or plants, ultimately affecting people. And so these are just some examples of these. A lot of them do cause like flu-like symptoms, but they can become more serious and cause issues like meningitis and even types of pneumonia in the lungs. All right, so what are some of the phyla when we're talking about this kingdom of fungus? The phyla get named by the structures that produce their spores, whether they produce them through sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction, but we do focus more on the sexual reproduction side. So telomorphs, they're going to produce spores sexually and asexually, and this is the group that's called the zygomycota. These guys are going to produce zygospores, and an example of this is black bread mold. So this would be found on bread, the mold that you see that's growing. These guys are aseptate, so they don't have the actual cross walls in their hyphae. So when we look at these, they are also known as the rhizopus or the lid risers. A lot of times these are the ones that push up, and they would make the lids come up on our plates. Now the next one is the ascomycotas. They actually produce their spores in these sac-like structures called ascus, and they are termed a lot of times as the sac fungi. So you can see those sacs here. These also contain some anamorphs. So they have no sexual life cycle at all. They also are going to include what we call the imperfect fungi. This was an old group. This old group was called the dermatomycota. These guys are not called that anymore. They're back in this group, but they are medically important because this is the type of fungi that penicillin is. So penicillin comes from a fungus. The last group is the basidiomycota. These guys are known as club fungi because the basidia is where they produce their spores, which looks kind of like a club. And this is what you kind of normally think of when you think of fungus, because this is going to be a lot of like your mushrooms. Okay, and so that's what we kind of think of when we think of fungus. And you can see here the structures that look kind of like clubs. So the next thing we want to look at are what causes diseases from the fungus group. These are called mycoses. Mycoses can be deep-seated, but a lot of times they're more superficial. All right, but if they are deep-seated, they're very hard to treat. So this blastomycosis is more systemic, meaning it's throughout the whole body, whereas ringworm here is more of a dermatophyte, which is more cutaneous or on the skin. So systemic is going to be affecting many tissues and organs. Subcutaneous is just right beneath the skin, and cutaneous is in your skin and nails. So kind of the outer structures. A lot of these mycoses, a lot of these fungal infections are opportunistic. They're usually harmless, but they can become pathogenic. And one example of this is oral thrush. So let's talk about the economic effects of fungi. So are these good or are these bad? So the first one, fungus can be used to make food and beverages. That's actually a good thing. Okay, so fungus can be used for that. Pest control, again, positive. This can be a good way to discourage pests from eating crops and things like that with fungus present. Tree blights, such as like Dutch elm trees, those are negative. It kills the tree. It makes the tree sick. Some fungus is responsible for food spoilage. Again, that's a negative side. Some naturally produce antibiotics. Well, we've actually exploited this and it's a good thing for us. And some are used in biotechnology to make vaccines and anti-cancer drugs. Again, that is positive. All right, so fungi for the most part has some really good economic effects. However, there are some that can cause some major issues. Now, fungus is going to grow different on plates than bacteria. Their growth factors are different. A lot of times they take longer to grow on the media than bacteria does. Bacteria, within about 24 hours, you have a good set. Fungus, it may take longer. They do thrive a lot of times in a more acidic condition, so a pH of 5, whereas most bacteria really wants a pH of 7. Molds typically are aerobic. So they do need oxygen that are present, but yeasts don't necessarily have to have oxygen and they can do fermentation. These guys, when we talk about fungus, are more resistant to osmotic lysis. They do have a strong cell wall, so they can resist that change in osmosis, the movement of water. They can see that they grow on jellies and even salt preserved foods. All right, and so this is why some of your stuff that is, you think, well, that's pretty preserved, can still have mold present, because these guys might be able to grow on that. They can grow in a lower humidity than bacteria can, and they do produce enzymes that break down more complex structural carbohydrates. So their food sources open up to be a wider range than what bacteria can handle. So what does this mean for microbiologists? Well, this means that if a fungal disease is suspected, doctors' orders need to be specific for fungal cultures, because fungal cultures have to be treated differently in the lab. So we have to use special media to accommodate their growth most of the time. We have to keep the cultures longer, so you're not going to get results within 24 hours, and different methods use different types of identification. So these guys are different than the bacteria. The last group that we're going to hit on here are the worms. This is going to be from the kingdom Animalia. So some general characteristics of kingdom Animalia are that they're multicellular, okay? They're heterotrophic, meaning they are going to consume their food, and they're eukaryotes. The helminths are the parasitic worms, and again, this is the focus. They are highly specialized organisms. They do have very complex life cycles. I'm not going to have you memorize their life cycles, but I do need you to know that they are complex. This does mean that they do have hosts, and they may have more than one host in their lifetime. Many are intestinal parasites. That's where they gain access, and a lot of times that's where they decide to stay, is in the intestines. However, some do venture out into other areas of the body. So there are two subgroups of worms that we want to talk about. And so the first one are the platymenthes. Platymenthes are the flatworms. So platy means flat, heminthes is worms. So some examples are the trematitodes. Trematitodes are going to be known as flukes. These guys get named based on where they prefer to live. So blood flukes, lung flukes, liver flukes, bladder flukes. So they get that name. But they are examples of flatworms. The next ones are the cystoids. The cystoids are going to be the tapeworms. Tapeworms are a lot longer. So flatworms are going to be, when we talk about the trematitodes, they're going to be a lot of times not as long, but they're going to be flattened, okay, and they might be kind of wide like you see here in this picture. But the cystoids are going to be tapeworms, and they're sort of very long and thin. They almost look like a ribbon. These guys can come from dogs, they can be in beef and in pork, and they can ultimately affect humans. These guys are pretty scary looking. If you look here, this is one of the heads of a tapeworm. It does have these suction cups, and then these almost looks like hooks, and that's how it hooks into the intestine lining, and it holds on. So as your food moves through and stuff moves through, it doesn't get moved or washed away with that. It can hold on to the area. It also is flat like that, so it can absorb the nutrients. So your body did all the work of digesting the food, but they steal the nutrients from you. So this is why they are considered parasites. The next group are the nematodes. Nematodes are the round worms. Okay, so these are going to be more round. Now, this is not earthworms. Earthworms are in a different group because they're segmented. These guys are smooth worms, but they are round like earthworms. These include things like hookworms, the ancylostoma, and the necator. Those are going to be some examples of hookworms. We also have the Ascaris limpercoides. These are going to be worms of the intestines. These guys, we actually, in our biology 2 classes, a lot of times we dissect these as early types of organisms. So you can see that they don't have a lot of structures. They're pretty simple when we talk about more complex organisms, but they are more complex than what we saw with like fungus and protists. The next ones are the pinworms. Enterobius vermicularis are the next group. Those are the pinworms, and those are normally very tiny. Believe it or not, a lot of people have had pinworm infections before. They're normally found in around the anus, and they cause itchiness, and it happens a lot of times when we don't wipe properly. So kids a lot of times get these more often. Then we have Trichinella spiralis. These guys are going to be a lot of times have cysts that are found in muscle tissue, specifically in like pork. And then those cysts can obviously rupture, and then you end up having the infection of this roundworm. And then the last one are the whipworms, the Trichurium. These guys are going to be the whipworms. So these are just some examples. And like I said, when we get into the different diseases of each of the body systems, we'll talk a little bit more about these. Another thing that's a big issue when we talk about the group Animalia are the arthropods. Arthropods are the bugs. They're the ones who have the jointed appendages, segmented bodies. They also have that hard exoskeleton to them. But a lot of times these guys are vectors, meaning that they transport a disease. They transport some of these things that we've talked about. They actually don't get really sick with it, but they can end up passing it on to other individuals. And so arachnids are part of this group. Arachnids have 8 legs, and normally we think about spiders in this group. However, ticks are one of the main culprits here. Ticks are part of the arachnid group, and they do transmit several diseases like Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. So RMSF is Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. They also can cause Lyme disease, also causing ehrlichiosis. Another one that falls in the arachnoid group are the mites. Mites rarely transmit disease to humans, but they're more of a nuisance. They do cause skin irritations, and these can cause major issues on the skin called scabies. Those are going to be normally known as like bed bugs. We also see that they can elicit allergic responses like dust mites. And so they can cause issues for us, but they don't necessarily transmit a disease. Once you get them taken care of and you get them removed, then you should start to see healing within the skin. The next group are the insects. These are 6-legged. So some examples that fall into this group are things like lice. Lice is the epidemic typhus is an example. This is a louse or a lice, and it can be in the hair, and it can be in different areas depending on what kind of lice it is. We also see fleas. Fleas are going to potentially transmit diseases like endemic marine typhus and the plague. So the plague was actually transmitted from fleas from rats that bit the fleas bit the rats, and then the fleas bit the humans, transmitting plague. We also see mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can carry lots of different types of microorganisms. Specifically, they carry mostly types of viruses, which we can see with malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever. They can actually transmit heartworms, and they also can transmit arboroviruses, which come from birds. And then we have flies. This is an example of one of those flies we talked about, the tsetse fly, which is going to transmit African sleeping sickness. And then Chagog's disease, we talked about it being the kissing bug. So there can be little bugs or beetles like this one. This one is a kissing bug. So these are just some of the examples of disease-causing individuals that fall into protozoa or protista, fungi, and animalia. Again, we'll hit on these more when we get into other chapters, but this is just a brief overview. If you have any questions, please let me know.